Government fails, the world's off its rails, leaders are whacked, democracy is under attack. It's time to get smart, folks, time to get real. Let's cut through the crap, tell us how you feel. Let's cue the talent, let's meet the host. Podcast by George.
Hello, hi, how are you? Welcome back to another podcast by George. We've got a returnee on the podcast. I think we're getting back to this guy quicker than I've ever gotten back to anybody. It's Matthew Ho. You may have seen the earlier podcast about my friend Gary Alexander. We had Matthew on to talk about the issues of post-traumatic stress disorder, which he's one of the worldwide experts on, and we had a lengthy discussion on that. And right after the podcast, my God, everything broke loose. Of course, we've got the ongoing coronavirus thing, but we've got the George Floyd incident, these terrific riots and police brutality around the country. And I wanted to get back with Matt because there's a military element intertwined in all of this, and that's his background, his experience. He's a veteran spokesperson. Matthew Ho's a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, a former Marine, an Iraq War veteran, self-described anti-imperialist and libertarian socialist. Matt, when I saw that, I kind of wish Bernie Sanders had described himself as a libertarian socialist instead of a democratic socialist. I think it might have gone better for him. Anyway, welcome back to a podcast by George.
Yeah, thanks, George. Happy to be back. Yeah, and I'm happy to talk about libertarian socialism. I know a lot of people are not familiar with the term, even though it's been around for 120 some odd years at least, probably longer. But yeah, I agree. I wish Bernie, and the same thing too, AOC up in New York. I always fumble when I try and say her whole name, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yeah.
I wish they would describe themselves in those terms and explain to people what they mean by that, as opposed to kind of making up this, I'm a democratic socialist kind of thing, which is a relatively new term and a new concept, and it's not really rooted in, the history of socialism, organized labor, political philosophy, et cetera. But yeah, there's a lot. We could do a whole episode on that. But I know you want to talk about what's happening now, which is just, God, we're in such amazing times.
Well, and it's just hour by hour. Before we could get on the air here and start this podcast, there was a story. I don't know if you've seen it or not. I'm going to read a little bit of it here. Mark Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, apologized today for his role in President Donald Trump's church photo op last week, saying he shouldn't have been at the scene. Now, I'm sure you saw that. I know a lot of folks did. What Milley said was, as many of you saw, the result of the photograph of me at Lafayette Square last week that sparked a national debate about the role of the military in civil society, Milley said in a pre-recorded address at a commencement ceremony at the National Defense University in Washington. Quote, I should not have been there. My presence in that moment and in that environment created a perception of the military involved in domestic politics. Well, I don't know, Matt, that almost is an understatement.
Yeah, and it took him more than a week to say such a thing, and he didn't condemn, or he didn't say this was, he said the photo op was wrong, the perception that comes from it, and I think that's a big problem we have with not just active duty military but also retired military, is the concern about the perception of the military and its role in domestic society, as opposed to the actual use of it or to how it actually is being, how it influences things. I mean, it's no coincidence, George, right, that we spend half of our income tax on the military, of the discretionary budget, federal budget, half of that roughly goes to the military and to the wars. And in our major cities, half of their budgets go to the police. LA, Baltimore, Chicago, New York, et cetera. Half of those budgets go to the police. And where I live here in Raleigh, it's not so bad. But 22% of our budget goes to police, and the next is fire and EMS, which is 10% of the budget. So we're spending twice as much on police as we are on fire and EMS. And of course, then multiples of what we're spending on anything else. Where I live, the county does the education system, not the city. So we don't really have an education budget for our city. But, certainly we have a large homeless population. Between 10 and 20% of our population in Raleigh live 100% below the poverty line. And then it gets to close to a third or 40% actually live below the poverty line. And we're spending all this money on, which really comes out to militarized police. We had a terrible here in Raleigh. We had a terrible incident of police violence the second night of protests. One person threw an empty water bottle at the police. And the police basically, and this has been verified by local media because they were on scene with their video cameras, opened up with tear gas, bean bags, and basically went on a rampage that night against those who were out in the streets, including business owners who were standing in front of their businesses to protect their businesses from having their windows smashed or whatever. So, where I'm getting to with this is that this militarization, whether it be at the federal level or at the local level, is something that is very real and just can't be, summed up, explained, dismissed, or whatever by these nice but very vague, non-committal responses from people like General Milley or Admiral Mullen, who is the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, former Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis. They've all put out similar statements that have been directed at President Trump, but not at the overall situation of the militarization of police in this country and the militarization of the seeking of violence-based solutions from top to bottom in our government.
And I wanted to get at that with you. And as far as Milley is concerned, he's kind of excusing himself on this thing. He just was told to get in line and walk with Trump. He didn't know they were going to the church, didn't know that photo op was coming up. Well, all of this stuff always goes back to this movie Casino that I cite all the time with De Niro. And I used the clip on Facebook. I may have put it on the podcast at times. But long story short, the slot machine manager gets his slot machines rolled by criminals twice in a row. And Robert De Niro goes down there and says, "My God, didn't you know after the first time that you got taken advantage of that it was a scam?" And the guy says, "Well, it's a casino. People got to win once in a while." And he says, "My God, it can't happen once. The odds are 4 million to 1, and twice in a row you can't calculate it. And the point of the matter is, you're either too dumb, Millie,
yes,
or you're in on it.
Yes.
Either way, you can't work here. You're out. I mean, you can't be in that capacity, in that role, if you're that dumb or if you're in on it." But I didn't want to spend the entire podcast talking about him, obviously. But you've kind of opened the door to what I did want to talk more about, and that is the military's role in what we're seeing in these police departments. And the way that I posited it on an earlier podcast, Matt, was in our society now with our jingoism and our nationalism and our patriotism, if you're ex-military, if you're coming out of a combat theater, really the number one job of choice that everybody thinks of is civilian policing. Uh-huh. And you're almost automatically included. I think you're even given an advantage when it comes to the hiring process. But there's an argument to be made, and I'm sure you would make it based on your experience with war and the traumatic issues that soldiers suffer after combat, that perhaps they should not be automatically included. They might be automatically precluded, excluded from going right into a policing role with a gun and a badge.
Well, for years, for decades, police have been, I want to say, like the appropriate route for veterans, particularly those who are in combat arms, because what else are you going to do? You join the Marine Corps, you join the Army, you're in the infantry. What skill set have you been prepared for when you leave the military? that suits what you've been doing for the last 4 years or 5 years or 6 years or whatever in the infantry. And so many of them go to the police forces because that's what's available to them. Now, it also fits into the mentality, the culture, the idea of brotherhood, the idea of us versus them. There is these, you can find all kinds of references in the culture of it. The idea that they are the sheepdogs protecting the sheep from the wolves, or something I've heard for decades now. And so the idea is very appealing. And it's in its many ways, as you said, George, seamless, because they do have a hiring preference for veterans. They are being hired on in many cases in departments that are that have a large number of veterans. I think in many cases police departments have 30 to 40% of their people are veterans. And further to your point, those coming out of the Iraq and Afghan wars, the wars, in the Muslim world, who have been in combat, you're especially conditioned to not just react, but to be proactive.
To hunt.
That's exactly right. To hunt. And, and you see this training too, a lot of the training that the police forces have received, particularly in the last 20 years since 9/11, they speak of citizens as civilians, which to me is a military term, right? You have combatants and you have civilians, and they speak not of citizens. And they have these trainings where it is, there's always a threat, where the idea is that every time you go out and do your job, somebody is hunting you. Everybody has the possibility to kill you. And, that certainly is not matched up with any statistics. I mean, police are killed in far greater numbers by suicide, and also too, and then by car accidents than by being victims of, assault or gunfire. But there is this mentality out there, as well as too, in the last 20 some odd years, 25 years, we've seen crime continue to reduce, but you would never get that from the philosophies, from the culture, from the rhetoric that comes out of many of these police departments. I think there are some exceptions out there, but it definitely it seems to be based upon whether it's anecdotal evidence, whether it's based upon studies that have been done over and over again by various organizations, whether it's by statements by former police officers, or simply what we see on our TV screens continually of police brutality, only reinforced, of course, by what we've seen in the last week or two, the way the police across the nation have. I gave you our story here in Raleigh, and I know everybody listening, no matter where they are, has similar stories. And the police departments that behaved with restraint, that exercised their duties appropriately in the face of these protests, that handled it in proportion to what was occurring, they are the exceptions. They're the ones that are few in number, and then that's obviously, you obviously have a system that's broken, and so much of this does come from, I think, the militarization of it, the view that everything is a threat and you have to fire first to defend yourself. The other thing too, and also as well as the us versus them, we're the sheepdogs, they're the sheep, we got to watch out for the wolves. Then there's the other thing too, that this goes back for longer than I've been alive, goes back to President Nixon and the war on drugs. And if you are going to have a war and you're going to use that rhetoric and you're going to have drug czars and you're going to fetishize the notion that violence is the solution, that the way we win this war on drugs, which is just, on the face of it, is idiotic, like any other war on a noun or a verb. It's just idiotic. Yeah. But, you're going to have these, not just culture, but the policies and the reality of the circumstances are going to match up with the narrative that has been put in place, which is why we have seen such violence, why we have such destructive policies in place, and while the solution always seems to be violence-based as opposed to anything else.
I was shocked. I got to admit, and I'm not easily shocked, but like you said, I looked at this widespread police brutality across the country, and I said to myself, "My God, don't they know they're on live television? Don't they know that
Yeah.
everybody's got a camera on their phone now? I mean, they're just unabashedly doing this stuff and full open view." And I asked Todd Blodgett, a contributor, he's on my podcast once in a while. He's a conservative, but he was involved in infiltrating the hate groups in the Washington, D.C. area for the FBI back in the 90s and early 2000s. And I asked him, where did these white nationalists, where did these hate group guys come from in the police departments? And one of the sources, he said, was the military. And in particular, the Army. Now, I don't know why that would be. Based on your experience with veterans and what you've seen and what you've been around. And he also said they're organized. They're just not some nuts running around. He says they're actual cells, groups in the military that are infiltrating our civilian police departments. Have you ever encountered that?
I didn't encounter anything like that directly. Certainly you heard about it, and the way it's organized, and as you and I were talking about, this goes back to the 90s. So it's been getting on close to 30 years now of it. When you infiltrate something like that, you don't advertise yourself. Right. So it's all done. If it's being done and it's being done, in a correct manner for infiltrating it to try and get something, because the idea of it is not to take over the Army. It's not to take over the military. The idea is to get that kind of training, get that kind of experience, and then bring it back home. Right. And then, of course, where's the best place then next to infiltrate to is the police departments. And we have seen this with police departments because we do have plenty of evidence of police officers who've been involved in right-wing groups, plenty of evidence of them being fraternal with militia groups or other groups like 3% or the Oath Keepers. And as well as, too, you see from time to time, you'll see photographs of police officers with tattoos that are white supremacist. Hey, look, if I was a leader in one of these militias or one of these white supremacist organizations, I would do exactly what we're discussing. That's exactly what I would do. I would want my people to get the training. I would want, as well as, too, as you build relationships, you bring people in, but we shouldn't just be discussing just the police departments, in this broader conversation, but all of the government structures, right, that allow for these things to continue. None of this conversation is new. Even with the infiltration into the police forces, this has been going on, as you said earlier, started with David Duke, back in the early 90s. So this is something that local governments, let alone the federal government, has known about for a long time, as well as, too, the issues of police brutality, the issue of the entire criminal justice system, the institutionalized racism, and then you get into the economics of it, which for me is really, I'm a big believer in looking at this through class and then race being a component of that. However, you look at the economics of this, how this is driven not just through police chokeholds, but through where I live in North Raleigh, very nice area. I have at least 8 supermarkets within 2 to 3 miles of me. I go to South Raleigh or East Raleigh where the black population lives down there. George, we could drive all day and not find a supermarket.
They call it a food desert or something
like that. Food desert,
yeah.
Exactly. And this is something that's been brought up before, and it's very basic, but I think it illustrates look, if the economy is structured in such that people are desperate, if you're really going to push this issue of scarcity, then you are going to have violence ultimately. And then when your response is organized violence by the police to suppress those who don't have what others have, yeah, of course we're going to have this tumult. But getting back to this issue with the white supremacist infiltration, yeah, this is something that's been going on for years, and it's something that I go back to Derek Chauvin killing George Floyd, and all the people who were standing around him, yelling at him, videoing him, and he knew it and saw it, and he didn't care. And then when he filled out the police report on it, he lied. even though he knew all those people had been there, even though and what that says to me is, one, yeah, of course, there comes into whatever belief systems he has, but it also is, it's a record, because he had been on the force for 18, 19 years or whatever. It's a testament to what he knew he could get away with, because he knew it. So he, all these people are videoing him, yelling him. He doesn't care. And he lies about it on the report. And they just released Breonna Taylor, the young lady who was killed in Kentucky, just this week. The police report was released on that. And USA Today had a story on it this week. I urge people to go and look at that, because the police report on Breonna Taylor, who was killed, shot 8 times by 3 different officers in the middle of the night during a no-knock search, wrong house or whatever it was. And the police report is basically blank. And so, who's allowing this to occur? Who has the oversight on this? And that's what I keep coming back to, is that this is ultimately about our government. The police are the low-hanging fruit. The police are the ones being caught on camera. But it's about the district attorneys. It's about the city councils. It's about the mayors. It's about the city managers. It's about the county commissioners. All these people who are supposedly in charge and are in charge, who are not doing their jobs. That's why all this culture of violence within the police forces that we were talking about, the militarization, the white supremacists, that's all been the effect of the war on drugs. That's all been overseen by our elected officials.
Well, and
that's what I keep coming back to on that.
Exactly right, and breaking up the all-powerful police unions, and the control that they have over all of this. And before we go, I want to kind of cite you a little bit. Sometimes saying less is more, and this really struck me when you talked about the killing of George Floyd. You had the officer that killed him. You have the 3 other officers standing around, not doing anything to stop it. And then you have this situation up in Buffalo. And everybody talks about good cops and bad cops. And they say, well, maybe there was a bad cop there in Minneapolis. Maybe there were 3 guys that were good. And then you look at Buffalo and you have the cop throwing that old guy down, splitting his head open. And well, there was 57 guys on the force. And so you had 1 bad cop, and people say that, he probably had 56 good ones. You looked at that situation in Buffalo. I saw just a simple statement on Twitter or Facebook, and you said, fire all 57. Because you had 57 cops, 1 that did the deed, 56 that came out in support of him after the fact and basically walked over the guy that was on the sidewalk. So, long story short, they're all bad cops.
Yeah.
And so you have a situation where you need to not just reform a police department and a system, but you need to kind of reinvent it from the top of government right down to the street cop.
Absolutely. You have an issue of where is their loyalty to? And this happened, a number of years ago in New York City when Bill de Blasio took office, and he was going to end, that stop and frisk, which, Mike Bloomberg had instituted, and just basically was official policy of unconstitutional harassment and shakedowns of every black and brown man they saw. And the police turning their backs on him, not all, but some of the police turning their backs on him, when he was addressing them.
Yeah.
And that type of insubordination, it you might say it's minor, but the reality is it shows where your loyalties lie to. And at the end of the day, these are men and women who are public servants, and their first loyalty is towards. Why the whole idea of police having qualified immunity and things like that occur, because if you look at it in a sense, well, they're public servants, but then of course a culture comes on, there's no accountability, there's no oversight, and things like that then become used for its own internal purposes, its own self-serving purposes. But certainly all 57 of them should have been fired right away, because what they were reacting to was, an official suspension of the 2 officers involved. So that's direct insubordination. And how do you trust any of those men and women to do the right thing in the future? How do you try? You can't. And so all of them should be. And I know I was in the military, so I have some good friends who are police officers. And these are all men, and these are men who I know are had joined because they have this desire for public serving. It's a calling for them, and I know they do the right thing on the job. The problem is that when you're working with people every day, you get blind to certain things, and your loyalty becomes tested. And then when you've been inculcated in this culture of us versus them, everyone's out to get us. Well, that makes a difference. And finally, if you are trying to be moral, well, how do you do that when you're in the midst of an immoral situation? We spoke about this last time about post-traumatic stress and moral injury. How do you be moral in an immoral situation? It's impossible. And I think that's one of the reasons why, police have such high suicide rates. You're going to act like that for however long, eventually it's going to break you. And, so I think on a minor level, you look at micro level, you look at these police suicides, and I think that can give you some explanation for how broken the entire system is and why our country right now is on, the proverbial knife's edge, so to speak.
Yeah, and it's shocking and frightening. You mentioned the situation with de Blasio, and it certainly is a matter of where is your loyalty, and it's also a matter of who's the boss. You don't want the guys with the guns and the tanks to be the boss. I mean, they can't be in charge of that stuff. We're the boss. I mean, and our elected representatives,
That's right.
The civilian managers of all this are supposed to be the boss, not the guys with the guns and the tanks, and not the guys in the police union either. If they run things, boy, we've all got trouble. And speaking of that, now, before we let you go, did you have an opinion, or what was your reaction when you saw those, I call them palace guards around the White House down there with Trump? Who the hell were those guys?
You mean the guys without the markings?
Yeah.
From my understanding, they're a Bureau of Prisons. But there was all kinds of issues like that. There was other ones outside of the Justice Department, I believe, who were similarly unmarked, didn't have, and this is an issue you get too with police forces in general when they cover their badges. Yeah. And I've been looking at some photos specifically about this, and you see many police officers in many situations around the country are out there on the streets unable to be identified because they've got all this riot gear on, so you can't even see their face, so you can't even say, it was the guy with the mustache who hit me over the head. You can't even say that. Yeah. Let alone the fact that there's no name tape or badge number visible. So and that's done purposefully. So you have this, but then at the federal level, my God, basically stormtroopers is how they looked like, and that's not hyperbole.
They're private palace guards was the way that I put it. I looked at that and said, God, if you ever needed proof that we're a banana republic, when you have a private presidential police force like that, I mean, that's the most accurate description that there possibly is. And we are a banana republic in a lot of senses, and economically as well. If you take away Hollywood, Wall Street, the military, that's basically what we are, and it was proven by the fact that the president of the United States has these guys not wearing. Is that legal to not be identifiable like that? I mean, aren't you?
I don't know of any state that allows police to not be identified. And I was out at Standing Rock in 2016, the pipeline protests, and we saw a lot of this there. And the other thing you see as well is the privatization. Just like as we have had such use of contractors for the U.S. military, we're starting to see that too now with things being privatized between security forces, whether they're brought on for private property or in certain municipalities, they are turning to that because there's a whole system in place. But your point about the banana republic, I mean, what industries do we have that are sustainable by themselves? I mean, what you rattled off there, Wall Street and Hollywood, the military is an industry completely supported by the government, and we have nothing else. Every other industry we have in this country that exports, say, is subsidized heavily by the government. Agriculture, fossil fuels, etc. Pharmaceuticals, because the way the government sets up regulations on that and how we have to pay, that's a government subsidy, right? I mean, so there's all these aspects that all funnel down to we should not be surprised at what's happening on our streets right now. You know, I mean, I think, and there was, so I can't remember. Somebody asked one of those palace guards outside the White House, I think as a Secret Service agent, about, are you surprised that people are here like this? And the response from him was, I'm just wondering what took them so long. You know,
Wow.
yeah, right. I mean, like it's obvious, and no one should be surprised. It's just like, I think the question is, how come it's taken this long? But it has occurred. We're having these economic catastrophes. We've had 3 now in this century, right? The dot-com, the Great Recession, and now this one. In terms of the racial tensions and the protests, I mean, we're seeing that basically, you know, fairly large scale every 2 or 3 years now, not at this level, but certainly in various cities. And yes, so it's just, we're really at a crossroads here, George. And the thing though, I think we should take away from this is like, what can we do? What can we manifest out of this? You know, what can we, what can come of this because we have this opportunity? I've never seen anything like this in my adult life. And so we have an opportunity.
Opportunity, and it looks like some areas are taking advantage of it. Minneapolis perhaps is going to lead the way, and everybody, oh my God, just like with anything. Now, we can't take away machine guns because that means I won't be able to go squirrel hunting. Like, no, you can take away the machine guns. That's okay. And we can't reform our police departments because there'll be anarchy on the streets. There won't be any cops. Yeah. No, I mean, that's not what they're talking about.
Exactly.
I mean, let's see how this, yeah.
I've done, I do work with veterans of peer support. I've done peer support work, and I have been involved in police in 911 calls for mental health help, and the police officers show up, right? And you're dealing with I'm not calling for police. I don't need guys with guns who have been trained to shoot first because they've been taught that they have to protect themselves all the time. I need a social worker. I need a mental health, therapist, and then you get told, I've had other occurrences where, the police show up and those police officers are great. They did everything they could, and the circumstances are such that it allowed that. However, then they call the county's mental health triage team. And of course, there's not enough of those people to go around.
Yeah.
They can't get out there today because they're dealing with another situation someplace else in the county because the county only has a handful of people like that. That's what I think, people who are watching this, who don't understand the whole defund the police movement and the reform. This is what we're talking about. 90% of police calls probably don't need men and women with guns. They probably need people with specific skill sets for that call. So let's do that. If we were going to start over again, how would we design, and it shouldn't be about the police. It should be about government. It should be reforming our entire government. What is our government doing for us is really kind of what I think the way for people to look at it. And why are we asking police officers to do all this work they're not trained for? It's just basically, it's grossly unfair to them.
Yep. Get somebody that can de-escalate. Get somebody and reinvent the culture to where a victory or a win is to de-escalate a situation, not to have a situation, not to have one and whoop the shit out of somebody. I mean, that's not winning. I mean, and you saw the result of that in these protests and in these riots. Well, we got to run. I usually try to hold these podcasts to a half hour. We're way over that. I knew it would be because you're so good. Matter of fact, the first podcast we did, people said, God, George, that guy's really good. He's better than you. Well, that's all right. I mean, I tell people, I don't have a lot of talent. I just know some people that do. Matt, is there anything you wanted to say here in closing before we wrap up today?
No, I mean, I'll respond to that point. The quality of the interview always depends upon how good the interviewer is. And I've been on a lot of interviews in my life in the last 10 years, and they are always only as good as the person who is moderating and asking the question. So if I come across good, it's because of, but I mean, I think there's so much. We don't have a police violence problem in this country. We have a violence problem in this country. We've got more guns than people. I mean, so there's so many things we need to take apart in our system that we need to reform. But I think certainly starting with measures with the police would certainly have such a great impact on so many of our communities. Kind of, just quickly, I had a conversation the other day with a person who does a lot of work out in rural North Carolina. And he says, you know what, it's the same thing as the cities out here. Lots of drugs, there's no jobs, people are killing each other, people are shooting each other. The difference is that there aren't police everywhere here. And the police that we do have are not tasked with basically trying to control the neighborhoods, which as outsiders coming in to control something, what do you expect? That's occupation. So, I mean, I think it's the reforming the police is certainly very necessary, but ultimately we have to look at reforming our whole systems of government. So that we've touched on so many things in this interview, so we don't have industries that have to be subsidized by the government. So we don't have communities that don't, so we have communities that do have supermarkets, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, that's well said. As always, that's our friend, that's our old buddy, our old pal, Matthew Ho, on the Podcast by George Live Line. Just really appreciate the time to come on the podcast. And folks, Matthew Ho is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. He's a former Marine. He's an Iraq War veteran. He's an anti-imperialist and what he calls a libertarian socialist. We didn't even get to talk about that, but we will next time. And I hope you like this podcast. If you do like Podcast by George, please like us on Facebook, subscribe on YouTube, ring the notification bell so that you get notified of new podcasts when they're uploaded. You can also subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, and all places where podcasts are seen and heard. But that's going to do it for right now. That's going to wrap it up. That's another podcast by George.